Before we begin, have you ever experienced something that left you speechless? A life-changing event? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear if something surprising ever happened to you. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss more stories like this. He never imagined that day would become the most important of his life. For him, everything had become a monotonous routine of trying to move forward, despite never being able to forget what happened so many years ago. 31 years earlier, his daughter CLA vanished without a trace. They searched everywhere. The police conducted investigations and they interviewed people from the ballet school where she practiced. But nothing, absolutely nothing, led to a concrete clue. The other girls on the team also disappeared along with their coach, sparking all kinds of speculation. The media quickly constructed their own narratives. Some said it was a mass kidnapping, others claimed the coach was responsible and had fled with them, and the more pessimistic ones insisted they were all dead. But he, Rick, never stopped searching. In the early years, he put up posters, visited police stations, and followed every lead that gave him the slightest hope. Over time, desperation turned into frustration and then resignation. Though his heart never stopped aching, his life somehow moved on. But what he didn't know was that on that day, unplanned, his world would once again revolve around CLA's disappearance. A simple detail, something so insignificant to anyone else, would change everything in a matter of minutes. He was at home, sitting in his usual armchair, when his young niece, Tasha, ran into the living room. She played with everything in her path, and in her boundless energy, her eyes landed on an old glass cabinet that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were memories Rick no longer had the strength to face, photos, small keepsakes of his daughter, and most importantly, a pair of pink ballet slippers. Tasha, with the innocence of someone unaware of the weight of memories, asked to try them on. He hesitated, but eventually opened the cabinet and took out the slippers. It was at that moment, when he saw the small bows on top, that his heart stopped for a second. It was as if time had frozen. For a moment, Rick was completely paralyzed. He stared at the slippers as if they were the key to an ancient mystery, a closed door suddenly opening before him. Tasha's small, curious hands held CLA's slippers with pure innocence. To her, they were just a pair of ballet shoes. But to Rick, every detail represented a lost story, a life taken too soon. He looked at the bow on top of the slipper, the same bows CLA had insisted on using to add a special touch to her shoes. How could it be that after so many years, those same bows were right in front of him? It was as if CLA had never left, as if it were all part of a dream. At first, he didn't know what to do. His emotions were in turmoil, and though he knew he had to move forward, the idea that those slippers might be connected to his daughter overwhelmed him. For years, he had tried to let go of that hope, but a small part of him never could. Now, there he was, facing those slippers, and hope surged stronger than ever. He couldn't let it go. Without overthinking, he decided to take the next step. He carefully picked up the slippers as if they were a treasure and examined them closely. His eyes, though aged and tired, sparkled with renewed determination. Memories of CLA practicing ballet at home flooded his mind, his daughter with that same smile, running around the living room, eager to improve, eager to impress her father. Now that little girl was gone, but something inside him told him the answers were closer than he thought. The slippers in his hands seemed to be the key, a starting point that would lead him to something much bigger. Rick didn't know exactly what to expect. He had lived with pain and uncertainty for so long that any possibility seemed too good to be true. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. As he looked at Tasha, still holding the slippers, Rick felt a mix of excitement and fear. Fear that this was all a false hope. Fear that the image in his mind, the image of his daughter, would remain nothing more than a distant echo. At the same time, the excitement of possibly being closer to finding her than ever before pushed him to act. Without overthinking, he decided to do something he had put off for years. He was going to seek the truth. He couldn't keep waiting for answers to fall from the sky. He had to take action. He told his brother Daniel he was going to the police. Daniel, cautious as always, tried to stop him, fearing Rick was being driven by unfounded hope. But Rick was determined. He had something in his hands that told him to keep going. He didn't want to miss the opportunity, even if he was afraid of what he might find. That night, while Tasha played in the living room, Rick sat at his computer and began searching for information about the ballet group CLA had been part of. As the screen filled with details about the ensemble Ital troupe, something caught his attention. In the list of dancers, he saw the name Celeste Kendrick, and the age match was unsettling. CLA would now be 35 years old. What struck him most, however, was that Celeste Kendrick was also known for her unique dancing style, something he remembered vividly about CLA. The fact that CLA had always insisted on those special bows on her slippers gave him a spark of hope. No one else, absolutely no one, had used that particular detail. That small tradition of his daughter was documented, and he had clearly seen it in Celeste's dancing. Rick knew he had to dig deeper. He couldn't let this slip away. The truth was there in plain sight. He just had to find it. With his heart racing and his mind full of questions, Rick decided to act. He knew he had to get to the bottom of this, even if uncertainty gnawed at him. He prepared everything at home to save time. When he left his house, the evening was setting in, and the cold night air enveloped him as he drove. The trip to the police station wasn't long, but every second felt like an eternity. Behind the wheel, he reminded himself to stay calm. Fate had given him a clue, and even if it was just a hunch, he couldn't ignore it. When he arrived at the station, the familiarity of the place hit him. The same faces, the same doubts he had carried for all those years greeted him. Rick approached the front desk, where an on-duty officer recognized him immediately. The man sighed when he saw Rick's face, a face marked by years of suffering, but also by a hope that had never died. Rick asked about the status of his daughter's case. Though he already knew the answer, nothing had changed, no new leads. But that afternoon, something inside him told him the story could change. The officer, without much hope, checked the file on his computer and informed Rick there was nothing new. Despite the negative response, Rick insisted. He took out his phone and showed a photo of Celeste, pointing out the bows on the slippers. "Don't you think there's something strange here?" he asked, his voice trembling but determined. The officer looked at him as if deciding whether his case deserved more attention. After a few uncomfortable minutes of silence, the officer agreed to look up Celeste Kendrick's name in the system. The minutes that followed were the longest of Rick's life. When the officer returned with the information, Rick could barely breathe. Celeste Kendrick was a known dancer, and while the age matched, the rest of the details didn't align perfectly with what he expected. But something in the officer's tone made Rick feel there was more to uncover. The doubt remained, but the small spark of hope didn't fade. With uncertainty weighing on him, Rick didn't give up. He knew he couldn't leave it at that. The answers had to be within reach, even if it seemed everything was against him. The officer suggested he go home and wait, that maybe there would be an update in the coming weeks, but Rick wasn't willing to wait any longer. With a knot in his stomach, he made a decision that propelled him into the unknown. He got into his car, and without a second thought, drove to the theater where Celeste Kendrick had performed. The Kendrick Grand Theater, a name that echoed in his mind, was now his only goal. What had started as a hunch had turned into an overwhelming need to uncover the truth. Every mile he drove felt like an eternity, but his determination kept him focused. He knew he didn't have enough evidence to claim CLA was there, but the connection of the bows on the slippers and the similarity of the details told him something had to be hidden in that place. When he arrived, the grandeur of the theater took his breath away. The place was stunning, its majestic facade contrasting with the anguish in his chest. Despite his doubts and discomfort, Rick knew he couldn't turn back. He walked toward the entrance, feeling the tension in his body rise with every step. The people at the theater seemed oblivious to his presence as he approached the security staff, asking for information about the place and Celeste Kendrick. It was then that he saw a group of dancers exiting the building, all dressed in the same ballet attire. Among them, his gaze stopped on one figure he couldn't stop staring at. Celeste was there, right in front of him, and though time had changed her, Something about her face felt familiar. Rick's heart raced. He couldn't help but run after her, his mind already imagining the words he would say. But when he reached the spot where the dancers were getting into a car, it was too late. The limo was gone, taking with it what seemed to be his last hope of finding his daughter. Rick's heart sank as he watched the limousine disappear down the street, taking Celeste and his last hopes of finding answers with it. He felt as if time had stopped. He had been so close yet so far. Without thinking, he got into his car and began following the limo at a safe distance, not wanting to lose sight of it. Anxiety took over, and every turn the limo made filled him with visceral fear. What would he do when he caught up? What could he do to confront her, to get the answers he so desperately wanted? Every question in his mind mixed with desperation, but something inside him wouldn't let him give up. The limo finally stopped in front of a grand mansion, the kind that seemed straight out of a movie, with high walls, iron gates, and a majestic entrance. Rick stopped a few meters back, watching from his car. He knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to jeopardize what he had already discovered. He decided to wait a few minutes, trying to calm his breathing and think about his next move. As he sat there, observing the mansion and the life unfolding inside, he couldn't help but wonder if Celeste knew who she really was. If she had ever had the chance to learn the truth about her life. How much damage had Reuben Kendrick caused? How could they have stripped her of her identity so brutally? At that moment, he felt a mix of anger and sadness. For all those years, he had been unable to see what had really happened, to grasp the extent of the damage that had been done. Rick knew he had to do something more, something decisive, but he didn't know how. Finally, he gathered his courage and decided to approach. He knew that if he missed this opportunity, he would never forgive himself. When Rick stepped out of his car and walked toward the mansion's entrance, the weight of what he was about to do hit him hard. Every step felt heavier than the last, but the determination in his heart wouldn't let him stop. As he approached the entrance, he pressed the intercom button with a trembling hand, hoping someone would answer. At first, there was no response, and Rick's anxiety grew. He wanted to step back, to leave, but the image of Celeste inside that mansion kept him rooted. Finally, a woman's voice answered through the intercom, polite but distant. Rick explained that he was a photographer and was there to take additional shots for a press article about the event. Though he hesitated, the gate began to open and he was invited inside. In his mind, he thought that if he could get in and gather more information, he might be able to get to the bottom of everything. But once inside, the feeling of oppression intensified. The walls adorned with extreme luxury, the silence in the hallways, and the cold welcome from the servants made him feel even more out of place. The mansion wasn't just luxurious. It seemed built to hide secrets. Rick was led to the main hall where the atmosphere was even more tense. As he observed the people present, he saw several dancers from the Ensemble Ital group sitting in a corner, talking nervously among themselves, as if they knew something was off. Among them, Celeste was there, watching him intently, showing no emotion on her face. Despite his efforts to hide it, Rick felt his heart racing even more. He was so close to her, yet so distant. He didn't know what to say or how to approach her. He could only hope the opportunity to speak with her would come. When he finally looked into her eyes, he could see that she had recognized him, though something had changed in her gaze. She was no longer the little girl he remembered. She was now a woman marked by years and the manipulation of Reuben Kendrick. Rick felt a mix of relief and sadness. He knew he was there for a reason, but the reality of the situation weighed on him more than he had imagined. Finally, the opportunity he had been waiting for came when one of the security guards pulled him aside and led him to a more private room. The room they took him to was empty, almost desolate. There was only a table, a few chairs, and dim lighting. Rick sat down, still staring at Celeste, who was a few steps away. He couldn't believe he was finally so close to her. In his mind, memories of his little girl and the woman before him intertwined. Was it really her? What had happened to her all those years? How had she ended up here under Reuben Kendrick's control? The question that burned the most was why she couldn't remember anything about her past, about her life before being kidnapped. Rick didn't have answers, but he knew this was his chance to uncover what had happened. The tension in the room was unbearable. He knew he couldn't stay silent. As the questions piled up in his mind, he realized he had to speak, to let Celeste know who he was. He stood up, slowly approaching her. He didn't want to scare her, but the desire for her to recognize him was consuming him. When he stood in front of her, his voice cracked but firm, he said his name. "I'm Rick Holloway, your father." At that moment, he saw something in her face. A slight hesitation, a small spark of confusion. He didn't expect an immediate reaction, but the feeling that something was about to happen made him hold his breath. Celeste stared at him, as if trying to make sense of his words, and after a long silence, she barely whispered, "I don't remember." The response hit him like a punch to the chest. Rick felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't give up. He knew he couldn't back down. It was time to fight for her, for what they had lost. He showed her an old photo, one of CLA as a little girl smiling and dancing with her mom. "Do you remember this?" he asked, almost desperately. "This is your name, CLA. It always will be. Don't forget it." As he spoke, he realized the words he had just said might be the key to helping Celeste remember, to bring her back to her true self, even if the process was slow, difficult, and filled with uncertainty. Celeste looked at the photo for a few seconds as if trying to find something in those distant memories, something that could connect with the name Rick had mentioned. But it wasn't easy. Her eyes filled with confusion, as if she were trying to unearth a piece of her past she couldn't quite recall. Rick sat beside her, still watching her, hoping something, anything, could wake her from the trance she seemed trapped in. "I know it's hard," he said softly, "but this is yours, CLA. It's your real name, not Celeste. Your mother gave it to you, and you'll always be CLA to me." Celeste's response was a deep, anguished sigh. She hugged herself, as if seeking comfort in her own body, and tears began to slowly fall down her face. Rick felt a wave of emotion, but also frustration. He had spent so many years searching for answers, searching for his daughter, and now that he was finally so close, he didn't know if it would be enough. Yet deep in his heart, he felt he was doing the right thing, taking the necessary step to help her reclaim what had been taken from her. As Celeste sobbed softly, Rick took out his phone and showed her another photo, this time of him with his daughter when she was little. "Look at this, CLA, this is me. Do you remember anything about us? About how I took care of you, about how happy you were?" Celeste's tears intensified and her hands trembled as she touched the photo. "I think something's there," she murmured between sobs. "But I can't remember." Rick looked at her with compassion, feeling her pain, but also a small spark of hope as he saw fragments of her old life beginning to resurface. At that moment, Rick understood that his mission wasn't just to find his daughter, but to help her reclaim her identity, her life, to heal the wounds of years of manipulation. Despite the challenges, Rick knew the battle wasn't over, and the real challenge was just beginning. As Rick watched Celeste, he realized that despite the pain and confusion she was experiencing, the first step toward healing had been taken. He had managed to open her eyes, even if just a little, to the truth that had been hidden for so long. CLA's identity was still alive, buried under memories and manipulation, but it wasn't lost. Rick knew the process would be long and difficult, but in that moment, something inside him gave him the certainty that he was finally on the right path. He wouldn't give up. Beside him, Celeste continued to look at the photo with a mix of sadness and confusion. "I know it's hard," Rick said gently, "but you're not alone. I'm here. I'll always be here for you, to help you remember, to help you find yourself again." Celeste looked up and stared at him, and though there wasn't full recognition in her eyes, there was something in her gaze that told Rick he was reaching his daughter's heart. "I want to remember," Celeste whispered. "I want to know who I really am." Her words resonated deeply with Rick. Despite everything that had happened, despite Reuben Kendrick's manipulation and years of suffering, she wanted to reclaim her identity. It was a start, a small but significant start. Rick looked at her and with a tender smile said, We'll do it, little by little. Together we'll remember everything. He knew the road would be long, that there would be moments of pain and doubt, but he also knew there was an unbreakable strength in his daughter. And though life had taken so much from her, the love between them remained intact. That night, when Rick left the mansion, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He hadn't fully reclaimed his daughter, but he had taken the first step toward her return, and that, for him, was what mattered most. As he returned home, his heart filled with hope. He thought about all he had suffered, but also about all they could still reclaim. Finally, he understood that true justice wasn't just about revenge or punishing Reuben Kendrick. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from them: identity, family, love. The next day was a whirlwind of emotions for Rick. He woke up early, his mind still filled with everything that had happened the night before. In the quiet of the morning, he felt that, though he had only taken the first step, something inside him had changed forever. He no longer felt as lost as before, though many loose ends remained. That morning, as he drank his coffee, he couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Celeste. He remembered how his daughter, so young and full of life, had always insisted on those little bows on her ballet shoes, something that made her feel special. He also thought about how that same girl, now a woman, had lost so much in her life, and how Reuben Kendrick had been the architect of that nightmare. Rick knew there was something deeply disturbing about what had happened, but his priority now was Celeste, his daughter. He decided he couldn't wait any longer. He called the police to ensure they continued the investigation, but he also decided he wouldn't stop there. He wanted more answers. He wanted to confront Reuben Kendrick, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. The fear of what he might find haunted him, but he was determined to move forward. Rick knew the path to justice would be long and filled with obstacles. The police couldn't do it all. He needed Celeste to speak, to recover her memories, to break free from Kendrick's control. He decided the first thing he had to do was ensure his daughter's safety. The journey to the truth wasn't just about uncovering what had happened, but also about healing Celeste, helping her reclaim her life, even if it took time. And though justice might take years, Rick vowed not to give up. As a father, his mission was to protect his daughter, and no matter what he had to face, he would do it. That morning, as he left his house, he felt a mix of determination and fear. But for the first time in a long time, he also felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The process of rebuilding Celeste's life wasn't easy, for her or for Rick. Days and weeks passed as they faced broken and fragmented memories, moments of doubt and despair. Celeste was determined to remember, but every attempt to reclaim her identity seemed to bring her back to the same place of confusion. The human mind has a strange way of protecting itself, and Celeste had learned to block out anything that reminded her of her past. But Rick didn't give up. He spent hours talking to her, showing her old photos, telling her stories of her childhood, of what her life was like before everything changed. With each story, with each word of encouragement, Celeste seemed to get closer to the truth. There were moments when Rick thought he had succeeded, that Celeste had finally recovered a memory. But then sometimes a simple gesture or word would make everything crumble again. It was like walking on unstable ground, never knowing when it might collapse beneath them. Yet for Rick, every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. One day, as they sat in the living room, Celeste began to talk about her mother. It was a delicate topic because Rick knew Celeste didn't remember her mother as she had been. But somehow, in the middle of the conversation, something in her face changed. It was as if a spark of recognition lit up her eyes. "I think I remember her," she said, her voice breaking. "I remember her smile. It was warm, like the sun. I remember how she made me feel safe." Celeste's words were like a balm to Rick, though there was still much to heal. The truth wasn't just in the answers, but in the process of facing those questions and finding the strength to move forward. That day was a turning point, a small step toward healing, toward reclaiming what Celeste had lost. Rick understood that the path to justice wasn't just about confronting Reuben Kendrick or seeking answers outside their family. It was also about creating a space where Celeste could heal, where she could rebuild what had been taken from her. And though the road was long and uncertain, that afternoon as he watched his daughter reclaim small pieces of herself, Rick knew he hadn't lost the battle. The true victory was in the healing process, and he was willing to walk that path with Celeste, step by step. Time passed, and though the wound remained open, Celeste and Rick's healing process slowly progressed. They knew the fight for justice would take time. It wasn't just about confronting Reuben Kendrick, but also dismantling the years of psychological and emotional abuse Celeste had endured under his control. Rick had never imagined that the true enemy wasn't just Kendrick, but also the way his daughter had been manipulated, stripped of her identity and voice. Each day, Celeste faced a new internal battle. Though there were moments when it seemed she had taken a step back, there were also moments of clarity, of recognition, like when she started remembering the old toys Rick had bought her, or when she recalled how it felt to dance in their living room, wearing the slippers she had always loved. Rick understood that the key to healing was patience, being there for her without pressure, without rushing the process. Sometimes all they could do was sit in silence together, letting time do its work. Justice, Rick thought, wasn't always found in courtrooms or laws, but in the hearts of people. And he knew that, in the end, his daughter would reclaim not just her identity, but also the peace she had lost. One day, months later, Celeste began to talk about her life before the kidnapping with more clarity. Her memories became more vivid, more detailed, as if the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. She was no longer as terrified of her past, no longer running from it. When she asked Rick to take her to their old house, he agreed without hesitation. It was another step in her journey toward recovery, and though he knew the road would still be difficult, he also knew the future was no longer as clouded. There was hope. And that hope didn't just come from finding CLA, but from Celeste beginning to rediscover herself, to reclaim her strength and sense of identity. Rick couldn't ask for more. Seeing his daughter start to heal was the greatest reward he could receive, far beyond any justice he might achieve against Kendrick. The day Rick and Celeste visited their old house was filled with mixed emotions. Though the house was no longer what it had been, its walls worn by time, for Celeste it was a return to something that had felt so distant, so lost. As they walked through the garden that had once been her favorite place to play, Rick saw tears fill his daughter's eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of a strange mix of liberation and sorrow. She had returned to the place that had once been her home, and though she didn't remember every detail, she felt that a part of her still remained there. Rick watched her with his heart in his hands, unable to stop feeling that every step Celeste took toward recovery was a triumph, not just for her but for him as well. They had spent so many years searching for answers, fighting for a truth that seemed hidden in the shadows, but now, being there together, he felt he was finally beginning to understand the true meaning of justice. It wasn't just about finding CLA, it was about helping her find peace in her heart, to remember who she truly was. When Celeste stopped in front of the old house door, she looked at Rick and smiled timidly. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Rick couldn't believe what he was hearing. After everything they had been through, hearing those words from his daughter touched his soul. "You don't have to thank me, Celeste," he replied. "I'm here for you. I always will be." Though the scars of the past would always be a part of them, Rick knew the future would be different. It no longer depended on what had happened so many years ago, but on what they could build together. Celeste was no longer the lost little girl he had been searching for. She was now a strong woman, determined to reclaim her life and identity, and he would be there to support her every step of the way. That afternoon, as they returned home, Rick looked at Celeste and knew that, though justice was still pending, the most important thing had already happened. Celeste had begun to heal, and that was more than he had ever hoped for in all those years of despair. Despite the progress in their journey toward recovery, Rick and Celeste knew the process wasn't over. There were still many wounds to heal, and justice, though close, wasn't fully in their hands. Reuben Kendrick, the man who had manipulated and destroyed so many lives, was still free. Rick couldn't stop thinking about him. He knew that someday he would have to confront him, but at that moment he understood that the focus had to be elsewhere. Celeste's recovery and the restoration of her identity were more important than any revenge or punishment Kendrick might face. Though the past still weighed on them, Rick knew there was something deeper that needed to be healed. Over the years, he had put his life on hold, waiting to find CLA. But now he understood that his mission wasn't just about seeking answers, but also about helping his daughter reclaim what had been taken from her: her life, her memories, her future. In the days that followed, Rick and Celeste began working together to rebuild a new life, a future free from the shadows of the past. There were difficult days, of course, moments when Celeste's memories faded again, but together they learned to be patient. Rick understood that healing was a process, and though there was no magic solution, every small step was a victory. As the months passed, their relationship grew stronger, more solid. Celeste began to go out with friends, to revisit old passions like ballet, though in a different way, without the pressures of the past. And Rick, though still haunted by memories of his lost daughter, began to see a future that no longer felt so uncertain. He knew justice wouldn't come immediately, but the peace they had started to build together was something no one could take from them. That was the true triumph. Though there was still work to be done, Rick knew that, in the end, Celeste would find her way. And in the meantime, he would remain her protector, her father, always by her side, no matter what the future held. Finally, Rick understood that true justice didn't come with a verdict, with revenge, or with the punishment Reuben Kendrick would eventually face. Justice, for him, was seeing Celeste reclaim her life, heal her wounds, and find her own path, away from the shadows that had once haunted her. He had learned to look beyond despair, to understand that though the past couldn't be erased, the future was still theirs to write. As they walked through the park one day after all they had been through, Rick looked at Celeste and saw a tranquility in her face he had never imagined he would see again. Though scars remained, Celeste was no longer the broken woman who had come into his life. She was a strong, resilient woman, capable of building something new. And Rick, seeing her smile genuinely for the first time in so long, knew that everything he had been through, everything he had suffered, had been worth it. That day, walking together through the park as the evening gently fell around them, Rick understood that despite all the injustices of the past, the most important thing was what they were building now. It didn't matter how long it took, how hard it was, because in the end, a father's love and determination had achieved what had seemed impossible: reclaiming his daughter, restoring her identity, and, most importantly, giving her a new chance at life. Peace had come, not in the way he had expected, but in a deeper, more meaningful way, in Celeste's reconnection with herself. Rick looked up at the sky and, for the first time in years, felt that everything was right. Finally, he had found what he had been searching for: justice, but in its purest, most human form.